My grandson was fighting cancer. And I didn't even know he was sick. The words didn't come to me all at once. They arrived slowly, like a cold draft slipping through a door I didn't remember opening, settling into my chest until I could no longer ignore the chill. It started on a Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sunlight falls gently across the kitchen counter, and everything feels almost peaceful if you don't look too closely. I was standing by the sink in my small Ohio home, rinsing a chipped porcelain mug I'd had for over 20 years, when my phone rang. I remember wiping my hands on a dish towel before answering, expecting a robocall, or maybe a neighbor asking for help with their mail again. But it was Daniel. My son's voice sounded different, tighter than usual, like he was holding something back. "Mom," he said. "How is Ethan doing? Are the treatments helping?" I paused, my hand still gripping the edge of the counter. "What treatments?" I asked. There was a silence on the line that stretched too long, heavy and uncomfortable. I could almost hear him breathing, trying to piece something together that didn't make sense. "The treatments I've been paying for," he said slowly, as if choosing each word carefully. "For the past 2 years. I felt my fingers loosen against the counter, the mug slipping slightly in my grasp before I caught it. 2 years. I hadn't seen my grandsons in 2 years. Not since Olivia decided it would be healthier to keep distance. Not since every call went unanswered and every birthday card I mailed came back with no reply. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I haven't seen Ethan or Noah in 2 years. I don't know what you're talking about." Another silence, but this one felt sharper, like something breaking. "That's not possible," he muttered. "I've been sending money every month. Medical bills, support, everything. Olivia said you were handling it." Olivia. Even just hearing her name made something tighten inside me, something I had spent years trying to ignore. I set the mug down carefully, afraid my hands might start shaking if I didn't. "I haven't received anything," I said. My voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. The truth sat there between us, cold and undeniable. On the other end of the line I could hear Daniel moving, maybe pacing, maybe checking something on his phone. "That doesn't make sense," he said again, but this time it sounded less like certainty and more like fear. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked around my kitchen, at the faded curtains I'd sewn myself, at the calendar on the wall still turned to last month, at the unopened stack of bills sitting near the coffee maker. For 2 years I had been stretching every dollar, skipping small things like fresh fruit or new shoes, telling myself it was temporary, that families go through phases, that distance doesn't mean abandonment. For 2 years I believed I had simply been left behind. And now, in a single phone call, that belief cracked open. "Mom," Daniel said finally, his voice quieter now. "When was the last time you talked to Olivia?" I let out a slow breath. "The day she told me it would be better if I stopped calling," I said. "She said the boys needed stability. That I was confusing them." I could still remember the way she'd said it, calm and polite, like she was offering advice instead of drawing a line I wasn't allowed to cross. "And you believed her?" Daniel asked. I didn't answer that question. Not because I didn't have one, but because I wasn't ready to say it out loud. Instead, I asked the only thing that mattered now. "Daniel," I said, "what exactly is wrong with Ethan?" The silence that followed was different from the others. It wasn't confusion this time. It was hesitation, the kind that comes right before a truth you can't take back. "He's been in treatment for cancer," Daniel said. The word settled into the room like a weight. "Cancer." I felt my knees weaken slightly, and I reached for the back of a chair to steady myself. My grandson. My sweet, quiet Ethan who used to sit beside me and draw pictures of rockets and dinosaurs. "Since when?" I whispered. "Since almost a year ago," Daniel said. "Mom, I thought you knew." I closed my eyes, the kitchen fading into darkness behind my lids. A year. A whole year of hospital visits, treatments, fear. And I hadn't been there. I hadn't held his hand. I hadn't told him it would be okay. Because someone had decided I didn't need to know. Because someone had made sure I stayed out of the picture. When I opened my eyes again, everything looked the same. The same worn countertops, the same quiet house, the same life I had been living for years. But something had shifted underneath it all. Something I couldn't ignore anymore. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady now in a way that surprised even me. "I think there's something you need to check. Because if you've been sending money, and I haven't been receiving it. Then someone else has. I didn't say her name this time. I didn't have to. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall and the occasional passing car outside. Each sound louder than it should have been in the quiet of my house. My mind kept circling the same questions, over and over again, refusing to settle. Where had the money gone? Who had been signing the papers? And the one question that refused to let me breathe normally: why had no one told me about Ethan? By morning I had made coffee I did not drink and left it sitting untouched on the kitchen counter. The sunlight crept in through the window, soft and ordinary, as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. I pulled out the old shoebox where I kept important papers, the kind you think you might need someday but hope you never do. Inside were birthday cards I had never been able to deliver, photographs from when the boys were small, and a few legal documents from years ago when Daniel and Olivia first married. I sat at the table and spread everything out in front of me, my fingers tracing the edges of the photos. Ethan and Noah, both in matching blue sweaters, laughing at something outside the frame. That had been the last Christmas I spent with them. 2 years ago. Before the calls stopped. Before Olivia decided I was no longer part of their lives. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my messages, stopping at the last one I had sent to Olivia. It was simple. Just a question asking if I could come visit for Noah's birthday. There had been no reply. There never was. At the time I told myself she was busy. That young families have their own rhythms. That I should not interfere. Now sitting there with Daniel's words echoing in my ears, that silence felt different. It felt deliberate. Around 9 o'clock my phone buzzed again. It was Daniel. His voice sounded sharper this time, no hesitation, no confusion. Just something cold and focused. I checked the transfers, he said. Every single one. They went through. Same account every month. I gripped the edge of the table. Whose account? I asked. There was a pause, shorter this time but heavier. Olivia's, he said. I closed my eyes, letting the word settle. It was not a surprise. Not really. It was more like a confirmation of something I had refused to see for too long. She told me you preferred it that way, Daniel continued. Said it was easier for her to manage the expenses. That you did not want to deal with the paperwork. I let out a slow breath, steady and controlled. I never said that, I replied. I know, he said quietly. For a moment neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to pretend. No misunderstanding to hide behind. Just the truth sitting there between us. Finally I pushed my chair back and stood up. I need to see him, I said. I need to see Ethan. Daniel hesitated again, but this time it was different. Not uncertainty. Guilt. Mom, it is complicated, he said. Olivia has been handling everything with the hospital. The records, the appointments. She is listed as the primary contact. I walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. Then I will go as a visitor, I said. I will sit in the waiting room if I have to. But I am not staying here another day without knowing what is happening to my grandson. There was a long exhale on the other end of the line. The hospital is St. Mary's in Columbus, he said finally. Pediatric wing. Room numbers change depending on treatment, but you can ask at the front desk. I nodded, even though he could not see me. Thank you, I said. After I hung up, I moved through the house with a kind of quiet purpose I had not felt in years. I changed into a clean blouse, brushed my hair and gathered my purse. The drive to Columbus was a little over 90 miles, a route I had taken many times before for family visits, that now felt like they belonged to another life. As I pulled onto the highway, the sky stretched wide and clear above me, endless and indifferent. My hands rested steady on the steering wheel, but my thoughts were anything but calm. 2 years. 2 years of silence. 2 years of money sent in my name, decisions made without me, a child I loved going through something no child should have to face. And through it all, one person standing at the center of it, controlling every detail, every piece of information, every connection. I did not know yet how deep it went. I did not know what I would find when I walked into that hospital. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not confusion. This was not a mistake. Someone had built this silence carefully, piece by piece. And I was about to walk straight into it. The hospital parking lot was larger than I remembered. stretching out in long rows of neatly painted lines that seemed to go on forever. I parked near the far end, my hands resting on the steering wheel for a moment before I turned off the engine. The building stood tall in front of me, all glass and pale stone, reflecting the morning light in a way that felt almost too bright for a place where people came to face things they could not control. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my purse on my shoulder, taking a slow breath before walking toward the entrance. Inside, the air was cool and carried that unmistakable sterile scent, clean but distant, like it erased everything human the moment you crossed the threshold. The front desk sat directly ahead, a woman in blue scrubs typing quietly on her computer. I approached slowly, aware of how steady my footsteps sounded against the polished floor. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I am here to see my grandson. His name is Ethan Collins." The woman looked up and offered a polite smile, her fingers pausing above the keyboard. "Do you know which department he is in?" she asked. "Pediatric oncology," I replied, the word still unfamiliar on my tongue. She nodded and began typing, her expression neutral as she scanned the screen. After a moment, her brow furrowed slightly. "I see the patient," she said, "but I do not have your name listed under approved visitors." I felt something tighten in my chest, but I did not let it show. "I am his grandmother," I said. "I have come from out of town." She hesitated, then gave a small, apologetic smile. "I understand, but the system requires authorization from the primary contact. Without that, I cannot grant access beyond the waiting area." Primary contact? I already knew the answer before I asked. "And who is listed as the primary contact?" I said. The woman glanced back at her screen. "Olivia Collins," she replied. "Of course." I nodded once, as if that confirmed something simple instead of something much deeper. "Then I will wait," I said. She gestured toward a row of chairs along the wall, and I walked over, sitting down carefully. Around me, the room was filled with quiet movement. A young couple sat across from me, speaking in low voices. A nurse passed by pushing a cart. Somewhere down the hall, a child laughed briefly before the sound faded away. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Minutes passed. Then more. I did not check my phone. I did not fidget. I simply watched the hallway, each person who walked by, each door that opened and closed. Eventually, a nurse approached, her expression gentle but curious. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked. "My grandson," I said. "Ethan Collins." She nodded slowly, then lowered her voice. "Family members usually come up directly," she said. "Have you spoken with his mother?" I met her eyes. "No, Iraplia. I have not been given that opportunity." Something in my tone must have reached her, because her expression shifted slightly, becoming more thoughtful. She glanced around, then leaned in just a little. "I cannot share medical details without authorization," she said carefully, "but I can tell you that he has been here regularly for treatment." I swallowed, keeping my face composed. "For how long?" I asked. She hesitated, then answered softly. "Several months now." "Several months?" I nodded once, absorbing the information without letting it show how deeply it landed. "Thank you," I said. She gave a small, sympathetic smile before walking away. I sat there for a while longer, the room around me continuing its quiet rhythm. Then, as I watched the nurses move in and out of the hallway, something else began to settle into place. Not just the silence, not just the distance, but the control. Every form, every approval, every piece of information passed through one person. Olivia. She had not just kept me away. She had positioned herself at the center of everything, where nothing could reach Ethan without going through her first. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands still folded neatly in my lap. From the outside, I must have looked like any other visitor waiting patiently for news. But inside, something had shifted again, quieter this time, sharper. Because this was no longer just about being kept away. This was about understanding how it had been done. And once you understand that, you begin to see where the cracks might be. I stayed in that chair longer than I expected, long enough for the light in the waiting area to shift slightly, and for the quiet rhythm of the hospital to begin feeling almost predictable. People came and went, conversations rose and fell, and still no one called my name. Eventually I stood up, smoothing my blouse as I walked back toward the front desk. The same woman was there, typing with the same steady focus. "Excuse me," I said gently. She looked up again, recognizing me immediately. "Yes, ma'am. If I cannot be listed as a visitor," I said, choosing my words carefully, "is there someone I can speak to about general information? Not details. Just process." She studied me for a moment, then nodded slightly. "You can speak with patient services," she said. "They are down the hall, second door on the right." I thanked her and followed her directions, my steps slow but deliberate. The hallway was quieter, the sounds of the waiting room fading behind me. I found the office easily. A small space with a glass window and a sign that read patient support. Inside, a middle-aged man sat behind a desk, reviewing paperwork. He looked up as I approached and offered a polite smile. "How can I help you today?" he asked. I took a seat across from him, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "I am trying to understand how access works for a minor patient," I said. "Specifically, who is allowed to make decisions and how that is documented." He nodded, leaning back slightly in his chair. "Typically, a parent or legal guardian is listed as the primary contact," he explained. "They handle consent forms, treatment approvals, and communication with the medical team." I tilted my head slightly. "And if someone else wanted to be involved," I asked, "what would that require?" "Authorization from the primary contact," he said without hesitation, "or legal documentation granting access. Without that, we are limited in what we can share." I nodded slowly, as if this were all new information, even though it only confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. "And the forms," I continued, "they are signed in person?" He gave a small shrug. Sometimes electronically, depending on the system used. But all signatures are recorded and stored." Recorded. Stored. I let that settle for a moment before asking my next question. "If there were ever a concern about the accuracy of those records," I said carefully, "who would review that?" His expression shifted slightly, becoming more attentive. "That would fall under administrative review," he said. "It is not common, but it does happen." I offered a small polite smile. "Thank you," I said, standing up. "That is very helpful." As I stepped back into the hallway, the pieces began to arrange themselves more clearly. Not everything, not yet, but enough to see the outline of something deliberate. Olivia had control because she had positioned herself correctly. She had access because she had signed the forms. She had authority because no one had questioned it. And for 2 years no one had reason to. I walked back toward the waiting area, my mind quieter now, more focused. This was not about confrontation. Not yet. This was about understanding the structure she had built, the system she relied on. Because every system, no matter how carefully constructed, leaves a record. And records can be followed. I sat down again, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, something had settled into place with a clarity I had not felt in a long time. I was no longer trying to be let in. I was starting to understand how the door had been closed in the first place. And once you understand that, you begin to see exactly where to look next. I did not approach the front desk again. Not yet. Instead, I stayed where I was, letting the flow of the hospital continue around me, while I paid closer attention to the details I had missed before. A nurse passed by with a clipboard, stopping briefly to speak with another staff member. A name was mentioned, a room number, a treatment schedule. Small things. Ordinary things. But in a place like this, ordinary details were never random. They were part of a system, one that moved quietly but precisely. After a while, I stood and walked slowly down the hallway again. This time not as someone asking for permission, but as someone observing. The pediatric wing was just beyond a set of double doors, secured but not entirely closed off. People moved in and out with badges, with purpose. I paused near a bulletin board covered in printed schedules and notices, scanning it casually. Visiting hours, staff rotations, support group times. Nothing that gave me direct access, but enough to understand the rhythm of the place. Morning rounds. Afternoon treatments. Evening check-ins. Predictable patterns. I turned and made my way back toward the waiting area. But instead of sitting, I stopped near a small station where a nurse was organizing files. She looked up briefly, offering a polite smile. Can I help you? She asked. I hope so, I said gently. I am trying to understand how families stay informed when a child is in long-term care. My grandson is here, but I have been out of contact for some time. She nodded, her expression softening slightly. Usually the primary contact receives updates directly, she explained. They can share that information with other family members if they choose. I tilted my head slightly. And if they do not? I asked. She hesitated, then gave a small, careful answer. Then communication can become limited, she said. Limited. It was a polite word for something much more deliberate. I thanked her and stepped away, my thoughts settling into a clearer shape. This was not just distance. It was control of information, control of access, control of perception. Olivia had not simply kept me away. She had managed what everyone believed to be true. I returned to my seat and reached into my purse, pulling out my phone. For a moment I considered calling her directly, demanding answers, forcing a confrontation that had been building for 2 years. But I did not. That would give her time. Time to adjust, to explain, to reshape the narrative in a way that protected her. No. If there was one thing I had learned from sitting in that waiting room, it was that systems reveal themselves slowly, and if you are patient, they reveal more than people ever intend. Instead, I opened my messages and scrolled back again. Not to the last unanswered text, but further. Months back. A year. Small details began to stand out now that I was looking for them. Messages that felt slightly off. Responses that redirected instead of answered. Phrases that sounded kind on the surface but avoided anything specific. It was all very subtle. Too subtle to notice at the time. But now, with everything else in place, it formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I locked my phone and looked up, my gaze settling once more on the hallway leading to the pediatric wing. Somewhere beyond those doors, Ethan was receiving treatment. Somewhere decisions were being made in his name. And every one of those decisions had a record. A form.
A signature.
A trail. I leaned back slightly, my hands resting calmly in my lap. From the outside, I was still just a grandmother waiting quietly. No different from anyone else in that room. But inside, something had shifted again, becoming sharper, more deliberate. Because now I was no longer asking what had happened. I was beginning to see how it had been done. And once you see that clearly enough, the next step is no longer about waiting. It is about following the trail to where it leads. By early afternoon, the waiting room had changed. The morning rush had faded, replaced by a slower, quieter rhythm. Fewer people moved through the halls, and the conversations that did happen were softer, more measured. I remained in my chair, but I was no longer just observing. I was listening. Patterns had begun to emerge, small ones at first, but consistent enough to matter. Nurses rotated at predictable intervals. Certain doctors appeared at nearly the same times. And most importantly, there were moments when information moved more freely, brief windows where questions were answered without the usual layers of formality. I stood again, this time moving with purpose toward a side corridor I had noticed earlier. It was not restricted, just less busy, lined with offices and smaller stations where staff seemed to handle paperwork rather than patient care. I paused near one open door where a woman in business attire was reviewing documents at her desk. She looked up as I approached, her expression neutral but attentive. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I hope so," I replied, offering a polite smile. "I have a general question about patient records. Nothing specific. I just want to understand how documentation works when multiple parties are involved." She gestured toward a chair. "I can explain the basics," she said. I sat down, keeping my posture relaxed, my tone even. "If someone is listed as the primary contact," I began, "are they the only one who signs off on treatment decisions?" She nodded. "In most cases, yes. Unless there is a legal arrangement that includes others, the primary contact handles all authorizations." I tilted my head slightly. "And those authorizations," I continued, "are they stored with identifying details?" "Yes," she said. "Every form is tied to the individual who signs it. There is a record of when and how it was completed." I let a brief silence pass before asking the question that mattered. "And if someone wanted to verify that information," I said carefully, "what would they need?" Her expression shifted slightly, more focused now. Verification usually requires legal standing, she explained. But internally, records can be reviewed if there is a valid concern about accuracy or authorization. I nodded once, standing up slowly. Thank you, I said. That is exactly what I needed to know. As I stepped back into the hallway, the structure became clearer. Not just the system but the vulnerability within it. Everything Olivia had done relied on one assumption: that no one would question her authority, that no one would look closely enough to notice inconsistencies, that no one would connect the financial trail with the medical one. I returned to the waiting area, but I did not sit down immediately. Instead, I stood near the window, watching the reflection of the room rather than the room itself. It gave me a different perspective, one step removed, where movements felt more deliberate, more revealing. A nurse approached the front desk, handing over a set of documents. The clerk glanced at them briefly before filing them away. Simple. Routine. But those documents represented decisions, approvals, signatures. Evidence. I turned slightly, my gaze settling once more on the hallway leading to the pediatric wing. Somewhere beyond it, Ethan's treatment continued, each step documented, each form signed, each decision recorded. And if there was one thing I understood now, it was this. Records do not lie. People might. Systems might be manipulated. But the trail they leave behind, the sequence of actions, the timing, the details, those always tell the truth if you know where to look. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone again, scrolling through Daniel's messages from earlier. Transfers confirmed. Dates listed. Amounts consistent. 2 years of payments, each one intended for a purpose that had never reached me. I compared the timeline in my mind with what I had just learned. Monthly payments. Ongoing treatment. Controlled communication. It aligned too neatly to be coincidence. I slipped my phone back into my purse and finally took a seat again, my hands resting calmly in my lap. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still just a grandmother waiting quietly in a hospital. But inside, the questions were no longer scattered. They had formed a direction, a path. Because now I was not just seeing the silence. I was beginning to see the structure that created it. And once you understand the structure, you know exactly where to press until it begins to crack. It was sometime in the late afternoon when the first real crack appeared, not in the system but in the people moving through it. I had just begun to notice how the pace slowed even further, how conversations became shorter, more direct, when a nurse approached the front desk with a folder held slightly tighter than usual. She spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. "There is a discrepancy in the consent forms," she said. The clerk frowned, taking the folder and flipping it open. "Which patient?" she asked. "Collins. Pediatric oncology." My name was not spoken, but I did not need it to be. I felt the shift immediately, subtle but undeniable, like a change in the air before a storm you cannot yet see. I remained seated, my posture unchanged, my expression neutral. But my attention sharpened. The clerk scanned the documents again, her brow tightening. "These signatures do not match the previous ones," she said. "Are we sure this was authorized correctly?" The nurse hesitated, then lowered her voice further. "That is what I am trying to confirm." I did not move. I did not interrupt. I simply listened, letting their words settle into the pattern. I had already begun to understand. Signatures. Records. Inconsistencies. The very things I had been tracing were beginning to surface on their own. After a moment, the clerk closed the folder and stood up. "I will notify administration," she said. "We need to review this." The nurse nodded, relief and concern mixing in her expression before she turned and walked back down the hallway. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. Because now the system itself was beginning to question what had been accepted without hesitation for so long. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, opening the messages from Daniel again. Dates. Transfers. Amounts. I compared them mentally to what I had just overheard. Consent forms tied to treatment schedules. Signatures tied to authority. If something did not match, it meant the structure Olivia had relied on was no longer holding perfectly in place. I did not need to confront her. I did not need to accuse her. The system was beginning to do that on its own. Minutes passed, then more. The waiting room remained quiet, but the energy had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. Staff moved with a bit more urgency. Conversations were shorter, more focused. Somewhere behind those doors something was being reviewed, checked, questioned. I stood slowly, walking toward the window again, watching the reflection of the room as I had before. It gave me distance, clarity. A way to see movement without being part of it. A man in a dark suit entered the hallway I had visited earlier, speaking briefly with the woman from patient support before they both disappeared into an office. Administrative review. The words echoed in my mind. Not common, but it does happen. I turned slightly, my gaze settling once more on the pediatric wing. For the first time since I had arrived, I felt something shift from uncertainty to direction. This was no longer about finding proof. It was about allowing the proof to reveal itself. Because when records begin to contradict each other, when signatures do not align, when timelines no longer match, the system does not ignore it. It investigates. And investigations leave traces. I returned to my seat one last time, my posture relaxed, my expression composed. Anyone watching would see nothing more than a grandmother, waiting patiently for news. But beneath that stillness, everything had changed. The silence that had kept me away for 2 years was no longer intact. It was beginning to fracture piece by piece from within. And I knew, with a certainty that did not need to be spoken, that whatever Olivia had built, whatever she had controlled so carefully, it would not hold much longer under its own weight. The shift did not happen all at once. It unfolded quietly, in small movements and lowered voices, in the way people looked at documents a second longer than necessary. I remained where I was, still and observant, as the man in the dark suit stepped out of the office and spoke briefly with the nurse from earlier. This time their conversation did not stay contained. "We need to verify parental authorization immediately," he said, his tone firm but controlled. The nurse nodded, glancing down at the folder in her hands. "There is already a request for updated test confirmation," she replied. Test confirmation. The words settled into place with a weight I could not ignore. I stood slowly, not rushing, not drawing attention, and moved a little closer to the hallway, close enough to hear without appearing to listen. The man continued. "If the records are inconsistent, we cannot proceed without clarification, especially not with ongoing treatment decisions." The nurse hesitated, then added, "There is also a discrepancy in the family medical history that was provided." He stopped, turning slightly. "What kind of discrepancy?" She lowered her voice, but not enough. "The genetic markers in the recent test results do not fully align with the documentation we have on file." I felt my breath steady rather than quicken, my mind sharpening instead of reacting. Genetic markers. Test results. This was no longer just about signatures or financial records. This was something deeper. Something that could not be explained away with paperwork alone. The man exhaled slowly, clearly processing the implication. "Then we need to confirm identity and relation before anything else," he said. "Notify the primary contact. Olivia." Of course. Everything still led back to her. I stepped back slightly, returning to the edge of the waiting area, my posture unchanged. From the outside, nothing had shifted. But inside, everything had aligned into something clear, something undeniable. This was the fracture point. Not the money, not the silence. The truth buried beneath both. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, staring at the screen without unlocking it. 2 years of distance. 2 years of controlled information. 2 years of decisions made without question. And now, a single inconsistency had begun to unravel all of it. I did not need to guess what it meant. I had lived long enough to recognize when something fundamental no longer held together. If the genetic markers did not align, then something about the story I had been told was not just incomplete. It was wrong. I looked up again as the nurse moved quickly down the hallway, the folder held tighter than before. The man in the suit followed shortly after, his steps measured but urgent. The system was no longer operating quietly. It was adjusting, investigating, correcting. And that meant one thing. The truth was no longer contained. I sat down again, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my gaze steady. I thought about Ethan. About the small boy who used to sit at my kitchen table, drawing pictures and asking questions that never quite followed a straight line. About Noah, always just a step behind his brother, watching, learning, smiling in that quiet way that made you lean closer to hear him. Twins. Identical, everyone had always said. Two of the same. But if the records were now questioning something as fundamental as genetic alignment, then that assumption no longer held. And if that assumption did not hold, then everything built around it began to shift. I did not feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was something colder, clearer. The kind of understanding that comes when pieces fall into place not with noise but with precision. Olivia had controlled access. She had controlled information. She had controlled perception. But she had not controlled the truth. And the truth, once tested, once measured, once compared against what was written and what was real, had a way of surfacing whether anyone was ready for it or not. I sat there as the quiet of the waiting room settled again, but it was no longer the same quiet. It was the kind that follows the first crack when everything still looks intact from the outside but you know it will not stay that way for long. Because once the truth begins to show itself, it does not stop. Does not retreat. It moves forward steadily, until there is nothing left to hide behind. By the time the doors to the pediatric wing opened again, the atmosphere had changed in a way that no one announced but everyone could feel. The man in the dark suit returned first, followed by the nurse, and behind them, a second staff member I had not seen before, carrying a tablet instead of a folder. They did not move with urgency anymore. They moved with certainty. That was the difference. I remained seated, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my posture unchanged. But my attention followed every step they took. The man approached the front desk and spoke quietly, though this time his voice carried just enough. "We need to update the contact records," he said. "Effective immediately." The clerk looked up surprised. "Based on what?" she asked. He paused, then answered in a tone that left no room for interpretation. "Based on confirmed test results. The listed parental information does not fully match the genetic profile." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. No raised voices. No dramatic reaction. Just a statement that changed everything. I did not move. I did not react. I simply let it become real. 2 years of silence. 2 years of distance. 2 years of decisions made without me. And now, in a single moment, the foundation of it all had been called into question. The clerk nodded slowly, turning to her computer. "Understood," she said. "Who should be listed moving forward?" The man glanced briefly at the tablet, then spoke again. "We are contacting the biological parent for verification and authorization." Biological parent. The phrase echoed in my mind, clear and undeniable. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, not to call, not to message, but to hold it for a moment, grounding myself in something familiar. Because now the truth was no longer hidden behind systems or signatures. It was written in something that could not be altered. Something that did not rely on permission. Across the room, the nurse looked toward the hallway again, then back at the desk. "Should we notify the current contact?" she asked carefully. The man considered it for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "But we proceed according to protocol. No assumptions. Just facts." Facts. That was all that remained now. No explanations. No carefully chosen words. Just what could be proven. I stood slowly, not because anyone had called my name, but because I understood what this moment meant. The system had shifted. The authority that had kept me out was no longer unquestioned. The narrative that had been maintained so carefully was no longer intact. And somewhere beyond those doors, the truth was being aligned with reality, whether anyone was ready for it or not. I walked toward the window once more, looking out at the parking lot where my car still sat under the late afternoon light. It felt distant now, like something from earlier in the day, before everything had changed. Behind me, I could hear the quiet movement of staff continuing their work, adjusting records, making calls, documenting what had just been confirmed. There was no chaos, no confrontation, just a steady correction of what no longer fit. I turned back slowly, my gaze settling on the hallway that had remained closed to me for so long. It did not look different. The same doors, the same lights, the same quiet movement. But the barrier that had existed there, invisible but absolute, was no longer the same. I did not rush forward. I did not demand anything. I simply stood there, understanding something I had not understood before. They had thought distance would erase me. They had thought silence would replace me. They had thought control would be enough. But they had forgotten something simple. The truth does not belong to the person who controls the story. It belongs to what can be proven. And once it is proven, it does not ask for permission to be seen. It simply stands there undeniable. I adjusted my purse on my shoulder, my movements calm, deliberate. Whatever came next would not require force. It would not require confrontation. Because everything that needed to be revealed already had been. And for the first time in 2 years I was no longer outside the story. I was exactly where I needed to be.